Dutch Van Der Linde, father, brother, teacher and leader. Born in Philadelphia in 1885, Dutch was gifted with a charismatic personality, which many found to be highly infectious, giving him a natural ability to lead. Leaving home at a young age after losing his father during the Civil War, he set out to a life of crime, feeling this may have been his only option. Throughout his time, he formed a posse, commonly known to the locals as the Van Der Linde Boys, then later, as the gang grew, the Van Der Linde Gang. But to Dutch, the gang was more than just a gang. They were his family, a group of criminals, although they didn't see it that way. They believed that the government had more than its fair share, and Dutch would intend to take from them and share it with the less fortunate. This was how he was able to amass such a large following. He valued freedom and dreamt of an independent existence from the restraints of civilization, and would preach his beliefs on the rest of the members. But this way of life and the constant battle with the authorities would put a strain on Dutch. He believed in one way, but the world believed another. As the life around them became more and more civilized, the Dutch Van Der Linde gang would be forced to flee from place to place, still trying to keep their beliefs. All the while, the law would be on their tail. Dutch would soon be forced to become more selfish in a sense, and soon stop providing for the poor, focusing only on the gains of the gang itself. Slowly over time, the stress and strains of this life would start to take its toll, and it was beginning to show. There's another video of mine which is titled Rise, the Outlaw's Way. That video tells the tale of how the Van Der Linde gang came to be, right up until the Blackwater ferry heist. If you haven't seen it, I'll leave a link in both the description below and on screen now. What you'll be watching today is a theory video on the events that transpired after this. Please be aware that there will, of course, be spoilers ahead for the game. If you enjoy what you see, be sure to hit like and subscribe and turn on notifications to be the first alerted every time a new video was produced. You're listening to Phil of Philby Gaming, and welcome to today's video. Fall, the demise of Dutch Van Der Linde. The Blackwater ferry heist had a huge impact on the gang. Several members were both killed or captured, forcing the remainder of the group to flee north into the snowy mountains, thus beginning the events of Red Dead Redemption 2. Dutch was advised heavily by his right-hand man and best friend, Hosea Matthews, to avoid getting involved with the heist, as he feared it wouldn't go as planned. Hosea was of course right, but Dutch refused to listen, and instead chose to listen to Micah Bell, who was one of the hired guns. Micah was known to be reckless, and for Dutch to take his advice over Hosea's, a man who he partnered with for all these years, Hosea began to see a change in his friend, rattling his faith in Dutch. Dutch, out of character, murdered a young lady on the heist. Knowing that the law was hot on their heels from the ferry job, Hosea would constantly attempt to convince Dutch that the gang needed to lie low, but again, Dutch would take an authoritative position and decide otherwise. Even after narrowly escaping Blackwater, Dutch quickly organised yet another heist, this time against an oil tycoon and businessman known as Leviticus Cornwall. Yet again, this was against Hosea's advice. This is a pattern that we would see frequently throughout the story. After escaping the mountains and heading south to an area called Horseshoe Overlook, the strained relationship between Hosea and Dutch would begin to show. The pair would constantly bicker about the decisions for the gang. Although there was no doubt love between the pair, tensions were always boiling. Even though the Van Der Linde gang were considered to be outlaws, Hosea would try to implement a system of discipline. But without Dutch's final say-so, the gang seemed to somewhat do as they pleased. Fights in the local town, brawls out in the open, even Micah getting himself arrested. It seemed that Dutch held the reins a little too loose sometimes. After all, they were supposed to be keeping a low profile. Eventually, due to all the noise that the gang was making, the Pinkerton Detective Agency would soon roughly learn of their whereabouts, as shown when they caught up with Arthur just outside camp. Following this, plus a gun battle with the entire town of Valentine, after Leviticus Cornwall learned also of their location, the gang was once again forced to flee, this time heading further south, now towards the state of Lemoyne. It would seem this time that Dutch had learned a little from his mistakes, as he ordered the gang not to cause any trouble in the town of Rhodes and its surrounding areas. The decision to move south would shock some of the gang, as it was clear that Dutch held a grudge of its people following his father's death during the Civil War. Was this a case of Dutch not thinking too straight, or was it just an act of desperation while trying to escape the authorities? Dutch despised the people of the South and would often undermine them. He highly underestimated their intelligence, seeing them as nothing more than simpletons. Attempting to play two rivaling families against one another in a chase for some hidden gold, Dutch would show a side of smarminess, believing he was highly above them all. Unfortunately, due to his inflated ego and lack of not thinking things through, similar to the Blackwater ferry heist, the gang would once again be ambushed, causing more death, plus this time the kidnapping of young Jack Marston, as revenge for Dutch's actions and decisions. During the attempted rescue of Jack, Dutch would show his love for the gang by leading them straight to the front door of the enemy, but his actions during this would seem somewhat extreme. After learning the apparent location of Jack, and once again also making too much noise, the gang were once again forced to flee. Now they would head southwest to a camp called Shady Belle, just outside the city of Saint-Denis. Dutch would despise Saint-Denis, as it represented everything he stood against. It was a thriving civilization which opposed Dutch's beliefs of living a free life out in the open, away from the man. He seemed to be heading towards more of what he hated. The person responsible for Jack's kidnapping was a crime boss who went by the name of Angelo Bronte. After ordering Arthur and Jack's father, John, to perform a simple task for him, Jack would be safely returned home. But Dutch wasn't finished with Mr. Bronte. Instead of lying low, he would form ties with the criminal overlord, but Bronte had his own agenda. He was angry with Dutch because of events that occurred during their time in Rhodes, as where Dutch and his gang would cost Angelo Bronte a significant amount of money by destroying one of his side businesses, moonshine. Dutch's ego would once again stand in his way, as he believed he was outsmarting Bronte, although he would soon learn that once again he had underestimated someone. Bronte sent Dutch on a wild goose chase, informing him that there were profits to be made at the local trolley station in Saint-Denis. Dutch saw greed. Leading a small team of just himself, Arthur Morgan and Lenny Summers, the trio attempted a heist on said station, only to learn that the whole thing was a setup by Bronte in revenge for destroying his moonshine business. During the escape, the train car that they were using overturned, causing an incredible accident. It was here that Dutch would take a severe blow to the head, rendering him somewhat senseless. This is possibly where his state of mind would change dramatically. In the very next mission, titled Country Pursuits, Dutch would begin to show his aggression towards the gang. He would refer to Hosea as spineless and heavily question Arthur's loyalty, calling him small-minded, and would go on to state that if nobody was happy in the gang, that they should leave. So much for family. In revenge for Bronte's setup, Dutch devised a plan to steal from the Bank of Saint-Denis, the city that Bronte controlled. But with the police in his back pocket, Dutch knows that he needed to silence the man. The gang formed together and attacked Bronte's mansion from the rear. During the boat ride over, he once again shows us a turn in his character. After the attack and getting hold of his adversary, Dutch performs something that shocks even his most loyal of family members. He tried justifying his actions, claiming it was either him or us. There were other, more dignified ways he could have went about dealing with Angelo Bronte, but instead, he chose the most horrific thing he could think to do in that moment. Dutch's mind state was decreasing rapidly. The bank job in Saint-Denis only added to the fall of Dutch, watching his best friend being gunned down in front of his eyes. They also lost young Lenny on the raid too, and John Marston was captured. Escaping proved difficult, but they somehow managed it and found themselves on a boat. Capsizing in a storm, a few of the Van Der Linde gang members found themselves washed up on the remote islands called Guam, somewhere off the coast of Cuba. While trying to put together an escape off the island, Dutch would begin to show signs of paranoia, believing that because John was captured during the bank job instead of being killed, that he must be working with the authorities. He began to display a total lack of compassion after murdering an elderly guide who posed absolutely no threat to him. After escaping the island, the gang would re-emerge at yet another camp in the swamps of Lakay. They were once again unable to lie low, and almost immediately the Pinkerton Detective Agency would arrive and rain a hail of gunfire upon them. Narrowly escaping the attack, the gang would collect themselves for a moment. In this scene, Abigail would express to Dutch that they needed to put together a rescue attempt on John, who was being held at the state prison, awaiting a hanging. Dutch would firstly seem compassionate towards this, but then would quickly turn cold-blooded in his manner, expressing that John would have to wait. Both Arthur and Sadie refused to accept this, and proceeded to go behind Dutch's back to rescue John, something that would cause Dutch to resent them, still believing that John was the traitor. Arthur catches Dutch mumbling to himself, showing signs of a madman. During their conversation, Dutch declares that maybe life isn't something people should cling on to so tightly. This indicates his further descent from reality. He went from being a father figure, a leader, and a brother, to someone who showed a lack of concern for his family. After the attack on McKay, the gang would be forced to relocate to their final camp, Beaver Hollow. Micah Bell continued to be in Dutch's ear, and now that Hosea was gone, he didn't seem to have much opposition. Micah and Dutch would begin to form plans together, all the while giving the gang very little information. It was something like a secret club within the gang. Without Hosea, Dutch no longer had solid guidance when it came to making decisions, and after his head injury, and of course the death of his dear friend, he was steering down a dark road. He would become irrational and make choices that made absolutely no sense to anyone, all the while maintaining it was part of his master plan. The gang would become involved with a group known as the Wapiti Indians, who were at war with the United States government and military. Arthur, now a sick and dying man, would do what he could to help their leader, an elderly man named Rainsfall, while Dutch, in the opposite manner, planned to use the tribe for his own personal gain, hoping to cause so much noise that the Van Der Linde gang could just slip away. Every time that the gang made too much noise, it always led to awful things, and now Dutch intended on making as much noise as possible, a dramatic decision. It was around this time that Dutch and his boys decided to aid the Wapiti Indians in rescuing a team of horses that had been taken by the military. The animals were being kept on a boat, so rowing in, the gang and its affiliates would stage a rescue. It was here, during this, that Dutch would once again suffer a second head injury, further adding to his unstable ways. In the meantime, Arthur would continue to help Rainsfall, and after learning this, Dutch would, for no real reason, also see this as a betrayal. Gang members such as Pearson and Karen would fall into deep depressions, but Dutch would seemingly refuse to even acknowledge this. This was not the same person whom just a few months prior would comfort a grieving Sadie after the loss of her husband. He was now fully paranoid, and his decision-making had become somewhat radical. Members of the Van Der Linde gang would slip away, one by one, in fear of their own safety, but there were some who chose to stay, including Arthur Morgan. Arthur chose to stick around solely so he could help the others escape, knowing that he didn't have a whole lot of time left himself. Dutch would put heavy influence on the Wapiti Indians for them to attack the United States government. This would eventually lead to many of their members being killed during a raid. This included Eagle Flies, son of Rainsfall. He didn't seem to care about anyone anymore, as long as he made money. He called for one more plan, a train heist against the US military. With this final job, he claimed that it would be enough to take the remaining gang members somewhere safe, where they could live free for the rest of their days. It was during this robbery that John Marston was shot. Dutch would go back for him, but later returned to state that John hadn't made it. The gang would then return to Beaver Hollow to learn that Agent Milton of the Pinkerton Detective Agency had kidnapped Abigail. It was here that Dutch really showed his true colours. Instead of launching a rescue, he decided to leave her behind. Now that he had the money he wanted, nothing else mattered. Arthur and Sadie would of course rescue Abigail, with Arthur saying his goodbyes before heading back to camp to confront the gang. John returned too, with Dutch admitting that he left him behind intentionally. Dutch, after hearing about Micah's betrayal, now doesn't know who to trust. The tense standoff is short-lived, after the gang finally divides up into two separate groups, followed by the Pinkertons showing up. After Arthur helps John escape, he is attacked by the betrayer, Micah. After the brawl, Dutch stands over a now dying Arthur. Without even saying his goodbyes, he simply walks away from the man he once considered to be his son. Any form of love that Dutch once had is truly gone by this point. Arthur died all alone. Some years later, Dutch would once again team up with Micah after they had separated upon that cliffside. It seemed that Dutch had now finally understood the truth about Micah, leading to him killing the man, and in turn saving John. But instead of returning to John, he simply walked away, just as he did with Arthur. Dutch had now fully isolated himself from his entire family. So what do you believe led to the demise of Dutch? Was it the death of Hosea, Micah in his ear, or was he simply like this all along and he just came to light towards the end? Let me know your theory below. You've been listening to Phil of Philby Gaming. I hope you all enjoyed, and I'll see you in the next one.